What if I told you that the reason the world feels like it's just completely falling apart right now isn't because human beings are acting crazy, but actually because we're acting entirely rational?
Yeah, that is a, well, pretty heavy thought to start with.
Right. But I mean, imagine you're sitting on your couch, scrolling through the evening news, and you see a headline about wildfires taking out a major agricultural hub.
Which happens all the time now.
Exactly. So you scroll down, and there's an update on some new pathogen strain. You scroll again, and it's an article about supply chain failures
Yeah.
or soaring inflation and, I don't know, a geopolitical conflict disrupting global shipping
Yeah,
lanes.
just light evening reading.
Right. And you probably just lock your phone, stare at the ceiling, and feel this really heavy, almost paralyzing sense of information overload. We are essentially trying to calculate the math of the apocalypse in our heads, and it just feels like everything is breaking all at once.
It really does. And, it's a profoundly modern psychological burden. Because biologically, we are wired to perceive and respond to, like, localized threats.
Like a predator in the bushes or a nightmare.
Exactly. Or a bad winter for your specific village. We are absolutely not neurologically equipped to be eyewitnesses to a dozen overlapping planetary scale system failures simultaneously.
And I think we tend to assume these crises are born from malice or maybe sheer incompetence. But, well, when you look closely at the architecture of modern collapse, like you hinted at, sheer cold rationality is actually often the main driver.
And that counterintuitive idea is exactly what we are tackling in today's deep dive. We are going on a mission to explore this really fascinating intersection. We're going to look at how modern systems science, the people who build mathematical models to study complex global networks, how they are diagnosing the current state of the world.
Right.
And then we're going to lay those modern scientific models right alongside ancient biblical theology just to see how they map onto one another. And it is an incredibly dense but really rewarding stack of sources we have today. On the scientific and structural side, we're looking at academic papers. Most notably, a major 2024 study from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research.
Yeah, that one is a heavy hitter.
It is. We are also bringing in insights from prominent systems thinkers and philosophers, specifically Jonah Wilberg and Zachary Stein.
And then on the theological side, we are pulling from ancient texts. Specifically, we're looking at the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Luke, and the Apostle Paul's second letter to Timothy. And to help us interpret those texts, we have commentary from some well-known evangelical voices, John Piper, John MacArthur, and Wyatt Graham.
That's a huge span of material.
It is. Now, before we get into the weeds, I want to make something crystal clear to you, the listener. The sources we're looking at present a very specific evangelical Christian perspective on end times theology. And our goal in this deep dive is absolutely not to endorse these religious viewpoints or, to tell you what to believe.
Yeah, that is a crucial distinction. We are acting as impartial guides through the material. Our objective is to explore the structural, philosophical, and mechanical parallels between how ancient scriptures and modern systems scientists describe this phenomenon of overlapping global crises. We're just looking at the architecture of the arguments, not taking a theological stand.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to understand how ancient texts might mirror our modern problems, well, we first have to clearly define the modern problem. The scientists at the Potsdam Institute aren't just looking at the news and saying, wow, things are bad.
No, not at all.
Right. They have a highly specific mathematical framework for what we are experiencing right now.
They do. In that 2024 study by Lawrence and his colleagues, they define this modern phenomenon as a metacrisis, or a global polycrisis. And the defining feature of a metacrisis isn't just the sheer volume of problems. It's this concept they call causal entanglement across multiple global systems.
Wait, let me make sure I'm following the terminology here. Causal entanglement means these crises aren't just happening at the same time by pure coincidence, right? Like, they are actively feeding off each other.
Exactly that. It is the complex interaction between short-term shocks and slow-moving long-term stresses.
Okay, give me an example of that.
Sure. So a short-term shock is something like a sudden pathogen outbreak or a massive spike in global oil prices. But a slow-moving stress is something like wealth inequality or the gradual degradation of topsoil. When a shock hits a system that is already weakened by a stress, they entangle. And they basically tip the entire system out of balance through feedback loops.
Okay, I think of it almost like a tangled ball of Christmas lights.
Oh, yeah, that's a good way to picture it.
Or honestly, maybe more like a really precarious game of Jenga. Because if you pull one block, like say you're trying to fix one specific economic issue, The whole tower might collapse because that block was tied to environmental degradation.
Exactly. You can't isolate the pieces anymore.
Yeah. So are we basically dealing with a situation where human rationality is backfiring on us?
Yes. And this brings us directly to Jonah Wilberg's insights in our sources. Wilberg points to the structural roots of the meta-crisis, highlighting what he calls perverse economic incentives and multipolar traps.
Multipolar traps.
Yeah, it's a game theory scenario. It's where individuals or corporations or even entire nations act entirely rationally in their own self-interest. But that rational behavior traps everyone in a collective crisis that nobody actually wants.
Okay, so if I try to put myself in the shoes of a decision maker, say I am the CDO of a massive global energy company.
Yeah, sure.
A multipolar trap means I literally cannot transition my company to entirely green, sustainable energy, even if I personally really want to.
Because of the incentives.
Right, because if I voluntarily take on the massive cost of that transition and my international competitors don't do it, they will just undercut my prices.
Huh.
I'll lose my market share, my shareholders will fire me, and the company will just be bought out by someone who will go back to pumping cheap oil anyway. So the system literally punishes you for trying to save it.
That is a perfect articulation of the mechanism.
Yep.
The rational move for your immediate corporate survival is to keep extracting fossil fuels. And since everyone in the market makes that exact same rational short-term choice, collectively, humanity just sprints toward a long-term cliff.
Wow.
It's the tragedy of the commons playing out on a planetary scale. What's fascinating here is how the Potsdam Institute insists that because of these multipolar traps and feedback loops, you absolutely cannot fight these crises one by one in silos.
You can't just fix one thing.
No, you can't have a climate solution over here completely isolated from an economic solution over there. Because the systems are causally entangled, they require holistic systemic change.
Which is just a wildly daunting diagnosis. I mean, we basically have to fix everything everywhere all at once or the system collapses.
Pretty much.
But what is wild to me is that this modern diagnosis, this systemic entanglement, it isn't a new anxiety at all. Humans have been trying to map out the end of systems for millennia. And if you look at the biblical texts in our research stack, you start to see a blueprint that looks suspiciously like a polycrisis.
The parallels are really striking when you look at the mechanics of what the texts are describing. So if we turn to the New Testament, specifically the Olivet Discourse, this is where Jesus is speaking privately to his disciples, we find a catalog of overlapping disruptions.
Right.
In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24, verses 6 through 8, Jesus tells his followers they will hear of wars and rumors of wars. He says nation will rise against nation, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places.
So right there, just in that short list, we have geopolitical conflict, resource scarcity, and severe ecological disturbances. But there's another layer to it in the other accounts, isn't there?
There is. If we cross-reference Matthew with the Gospel of Luke, chapter 21, Luke adds these really specific granular details. He includes the Greek word loimoi, which translates to pestilences, plagues, or, well, what we would call pandemics today.
Okay, wow.
Yeah. And Luke also describes cosmic signs and a profound distress of nations. He explicitly notes that people will be fainting from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world.
So if we look at that, we have the climate crisis and the earthquakes and famines, the public health crisis and the pestilences, and the geopolitical crisis and the wars. It maps almost one-to-one with the Potsdam Institute's domains of risk.
It really does.
But, the modern systems thinkers emphasize that the physical systems only collapse because human behavior drives them there. Does the ancient text account for the psychological side of the meta-crisis?
It does, profoundly so in the writings of the Apostle Paul. In Paul's second letter to Timothy, chapter 3, he shifts the focus from external disasters to internal societal decay.
What does he say?
Paul warns that in the last days, people will become lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, ungrateful, and unholy. He's describing a pervasive fracturing of human relationships and basic empathy.
Let's connect that to modern psychology because lovers of themselves sounds, like a moral judgment, but functionally it describes a scarcity mindset.
Exactly.
When physical systems fracture, when there's a famine or a supply chain shock, trust just evaporates. People panic. They stop thinking about the community and start hoarding resources for their own survival. Which, ironically, is exactly what artificially breaks the supply chain and justifies the hoarding in the first place. It's just a massive self-fulfilling prophecy.
And that is precisely the connection Zachary Stein makes in his work for the Research Institute Perspectiva. Stein argues that alongside our measurable ecological and economic crises, Humanity is suffering from a massive, invisible crisis.
An invisible crisis.
Yeah, it is a crisis of the mind, a breakdown of culture and meaning-making. Stein's modern observation is that we no longer have the cultural capacity or the shared reality to cooperate.
Wow.
And that mirrors Paul's ancient warning in 2 Timothy perfectly. The physical infrastructure, the supply chains, the power grids, those things break down because the human software running them, our capacity for trust and selflessness, breaks down first.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because neither the modern scientists nor the ancient texts just give us a static list of bad things. They don't just say, here's a list of problems. They both describe a specific trajectory.
Right.
In our sources, the evangelical commentator John MacArthur points out a highly specific phrase Jesus uses in Matthew 24. After listing the wars, famines, and earthquakes, Jesus calls them the beginning of birth pains. And MacArthur notes that this metaphor is incredibly deliberate.
It is, because birth pains or labor contractions have a distinct mechanical nature. They don't just happen at random, even intervals. As the event draws closer, contractions increase in both frequency and intensity.
And think about the mathematical parallel there. The ancient biblical concept of accelerating birth pains is the exact same mechanical concept as the modern scientific idea of accelerating domino effects and feedback loops.
Absolutely.
Both frameworks are relying on the mathematics of exponential curves. It's not linear. It's not that things get worse at a steady rate of 1, 2, 3, 4, giving us plenty of time to adapt in between each crisis. It's exponential, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. The shocks start overlapping before the global system has time to recover from the previous one. So the time we have to react just constantly shrinks.
It is a really sobering alignment. Both a theologian reading the gospel and the systems scientist crunching the data are warning us that the timeline of crisis accelerates as it compounds.
But if I'm a listener digesting all of this, if the math says the crises are accelerating and they're hopelessly entangled in these multipolar traps, the biological evolutionary response is pure panic.
Of course it is.
I mean, the instinct is to build a bunker, hoard canned goods, and completely despair about the future. But when you look at the sources, there is this incredible, almost jarring irony in how the biblical texts command people to react to this information.
Yeah, the emotional posture demanded by the texts is entirely counterintuitive to the scale of the threat. In Matthew 24, Jesus predicts this terrifying, exponential global turmoil, and then in verse 6, he immediately commands his followers, "See that you are not alarmed."
You not be alarmed. Which sounds almost absurd, right? The world is effectively on fire, the math says it's going to get hotter, and you're told not to panic. So how do the commentators in our stack explain that tension? How do you stare down a mathematically accelerating polycrisis and simply not be alarmed?
Well, the evangelical commentators in our sources provide strong theological guardrails to manage that exact psychological tension. The first major guardrail is an absolute prohibition on date setting, or, trying to predict the exact timeline of the collapse.
Right.
Wyatt Graham, writing for the Gospel Coalition, points directly to Matthew 24.36. In that verse, Jesus explicitly states that no one knows the day or the hour of the end, not the angels, and not even Jesus himself in his humanity, but only the Father. Graham emphasizes that obsessing over the timeline is a direct violation of the text.
Because date setting is really just an illusion of control, isn't it? If I can draw a chart with red string and predict the apocalypse is happening on a Tuesday in November, I feel like I have some agency over the chaos. The text is actively stripping away that false sense of control.
It is. And the second guardrail, detailed by John Piper, addresses the danger of fear-mongering and excessive news consumption. Piper points out that the real danger for someone watching these global systems fracture isn't necessarily that they will misinterpret the signs. The true danger is that the constant, overwhelming barrage of bad news will cause a person to become what he calls drunk and dull to God's presence.
Drunk and dull. Explain what that looks like psychologically.
It basically means dopamine burnout. When you are constantly doom scrolling, exposing your brain to planetary scale threats that you cannot control, your nervous system eventually just shuts down to protect itself.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You become paralyzed by cynicism. You become numb, apathetic, and complacent. Piper argues that seeing these interconnected signs shouldn't make people frantic, nor should it make them numb. It should demand a posture of watchful readiness. This raises an important question, though. If we are prohibited from panicking, if we aren't supposed to build doomsday bunkers, and if we're warned against becoming numb and cynical, what exactly does watchful readiness actually look like in the middle of a causally entangled polycrisis? How do we move this from a theoretical discussion about system science into actual on-the-ground action?
And according to the sources, moving from theory to action involves a very specific threefold path. The first step is a radical return to spiritual disciplines over self-soothing.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Because remember, Paul's warning in 2 Timothy about people becoming lovers of pleasure as society breaks down. When we get anxious, our instinct is to numb ourselves with consumption, whether that's media, food, or material goods. The texts, specifically Titus 2.11, suggest the antidote is choosing practices of prayer, self-control, and holiness.
It is about becoming an anchor of stability. If everyone around you is fainting from terror, as Luke described, simply offering a calm, grounded, unanxious presence is a radical act of gospel witness.
Yeah.
But the sources don't just stop at personal spirituality or inner peace.
Mm.
There is a deeply structural communal response demanded as well.
Right, because personal peace doesn't fix a broken supply chain.
Exactly. The final part of the path is robust community resilience. This is where the macro-level system science meets the micro-level local neighborhood. The texts repeatedly call on individuals to absorb the shocks of a crisis collectively. Galatians 6.2 explicitly commands believers to bear one another's burdens. In a systems science framework, bearing burdens literally means acting as a localized shock absorber when the macro system fails.
Let's make that incredibly concrete for the listener. What does bearing one another's burdens actually look like when we are talking about a meta crisis?
Yeah, what does that look like?
Well, based on these sources, it looks like hyper-local practical resilience. It looks like a rural pastor recognizing that climate extremes are causing local flooding, and instead of just preaching about the end times, they organize a flood relief kitchen so the community isn't entirely dependent on slow-moving federal aid.
Wow, yeah.
It looks like an urban church looking at the economic shifts caused by AI and automation and offering training programs to help unemployed people secure green jobs. It looks like living out Proverbs 31.8 to 9, which demands that we speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves and actively defend the rights of the poor and vulnerable, because those are the people who are crushed first by these systemic failures.
That is the synthesis of the entire deep dive. The meta-crisis is global, massive, and structurally entangled. But the response modeled in the sources is highly local, relational, and scaled to the human level.
Right.
When the global systems, the international markets, the macro climates, the federal safety nets, when they begin to fracture under the weight of feedback loops, the only viable safety net left is the strength and proximity of the local community network.
So what does this all mean? Whether you're looking at the world through the clinical, data-driven lens of a Potsdam Institute scientist mapping out a polycrisis, or you're looking through the ancient theological lens of a rural pastor reading the Gospel of Matthew, the diagnosis is functionally the same. The systems are entangled, and they are fracturing. But the solution to a fragmented world isn't to retreat into isolation or fall into a multipolar trap of selfishness. The solution is resilient, hyperlocal, community-level care.
And the ultimate message we can draw from synthesizing these diverse sources is that overlapping crises do not have to dictate a future of despair. From the perspective of the biblical commentators, these moments of intense exponential pressure are actually a profound opportunity. Yes. They serve to purify faith, force us to rely on one another, and spread light in a very dark room. The texts encourage looking forward to a new heavens and a new earth, as described in 2 Peter 3.13. That eschatological hope is the psychological anchor. It allows individuals to engage deeply with a crumbling system, to bear the burdens of their neighbors without being emotionally crushed by the weight of it all.
And that is the exact takeaway I want you, the listener, to hold on to today. We live in an era of unprecedented, unavoidable information overload. That constant awareness of the meta-crisis is a recipe for paralyzing anxiety and cynicism. But by understanding this dual framework, by clearly seeing the mathematical structural entanglement of the crises, while adopting the calm, watchful readiness advocated by these ancient scriptures, you can completely shift your mindset. You can move away from paralyzed fear and step into proactive, community-focused action. You don't have to fix the whole globe, you just have to bear the burden of the person next to you. I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over as you go about your week. We spent this entire deep dive looking at how a meta-crisis acts as a negative feedback loop. How a pandemic, economic strain, and social conflict all drag each other down, accelerating the collapse. But if the mathematics of these systems are truly that deeply entangled, could the reverse also be true?
Oh, wow.
Right. If you decide to start a neighborhood flood relief kitchen, or you mentor someone who lost their job, or you simply choose to be an unanxious presence in a terrified room, could acts of radical local community resilience create a positive feedback loop? Could your small, hyper-local actions cascade upward, healing those entangled systems just as exponentially as they fall apart? Think about that the next time you find yourself staring at your phone, scrolling through the evening news. The world might be entangled in crisis, but you are entangled in it too, which means you hold the power to pull the wires in a completely different direction.